This is my Byzantine Emperor tier list video. It's not scripted like any of my others, so I'm really not sure how this is going to go. I'm slightly nervous, but I think overall it should go well. Anyway, you know how tier lists work, so I won't drag this intro out. However, I do just want to say I've got a special non-applicable tier at the bottom, which is basically for those emperors who I think can't really be judged good or bad because they either were children during their reign or reigned for such a short period of time that they really can't be judged, like Heraclius or John IV. Anyway, we're going to start this list off with Constantine I, who I think deserves A, perhaps not S tier, but I think very high A, considering that he set the tone, I think, for Byzantium. I mean, just establishing Constantinople by itself, when you really think about it, if everything else had gone the way it had gone, but Byzantium hadn't had Constantinople as a fortified centre, then the 7th century crises, the loss of Egypt and Africa, and then the Arab invasions, I mean, where would the empire have retreated to? It probably would have had its capital at Nicomedia, maybe Serdica. Without Constantinople's strong position, the empire could well have been obliterated in the 7th century. Then of course, just in his own time, Constantine was a very successful general, winning many civil wars and then also leading successful campaigns against the barbarians to the north. He's most famous perhaps for favouring Christianity and trying to forge an imperial church. This was certainly the most momentous decision Constantine I ever took, although debating its effects, whether good or bad for the empire, would take all day. He was critical in establishing a set orthodoxy, but of course this had the effect of bringing the state into Christian sectarian struggles, potentially alienating large segments of the population in the process. At the same time, Christianity could be a unifier for the peoples of the empire. Moving to his son, Constantius II, I'm putting him in B tier because, with the exception of his later reign when he encountered more trouble with the Sassanids and then had Julian's revolt, overall he defended the empire very capably, I think. He brutally massacred much of his family after his accession. I mean, that's pretty merciless, but at the same time it's probably a rather good policy for imperial stability. He was able to put down the usurper Magnentius, although of course he never got round to defeating Julian. Overall, I'd say he was a competent ruler, dealt with all the threats that were put before him with, consummate skill. But I wouldn't say he's deserving of A tier. Then we come to Julian, an emperor who I was almost considering putting in C tier because of how disastrous his Persian campaign went. Julian, aside from being, of course, the famous pagan in a time of rising Christianity, is perhaps most famous for his invasion of Persia, which started off well but went disastrously wrong, and I was considering putting him in C tier simply for how poorly that went. But on the whole, I think his reign, when you consider the fact that he, as Caesar in Gaul in particular, he won several victories against the barbarians, he was a conscientious administrator, although, his attempts to revive paganism in the end were doomed to failure, but perhaps that was just because he reigned for so brief a period. But I'll put Julian in B tier. We have another short-lived emperor, Jovian, who I feel a bit unfortunate for because he was basically picking up the pieces of Julian's failed invasion of Persia. He was forced to hand over lots of territory in the retreat, signed a fairly humiliating peace treaty, and died before he got back home. Well, he got over the border, but, he didn't get back to the capital. I feel bad giving him a C tier. There's not really any successors I can point to in his reign. Then we have the Valentinian dynasty. Now, technically, Jovian would have been succeeded by Valentinian I, but I'm not going to count Valentinian or Gratian, because although technically both of them ruled in the east, it was for a very short period before they handed over to a subordinate. So we're going to go straight to Valens, who I'm going to give a C. I think for most of his reign he did a good job, but the defeat at Adrianople was just so catastrophically bad. Not waiting for Gratian's reinforcements before that battle. We can't know for sure how it would have turned out, but it probably would have turned out a lot better than the massive slaughter. The death of Valens and of 2/3 of the Roman field army was just catastrophic. I really can't give him anything more than a C, unfortunately, which I do feel slightly bad about. I've always liked Valens for some reason. Next we have Theodosius I, the man whom Gratian appointed to manage the East in the aftermath of Adrianople, and the man who basically had to clean up the disaster that Valens had caused. I'm going to give him a B, which, considering some people call him the Great, perhaps some people might be surprised by, but I think he was a B-tier emperor overall. He dealt admirably with the Gothic War, with that whole crisis, but again, he didn't permanently suppress or disband the Goths as a force, and so, shortly after he died, they would again be active and, terrorising both East and West under the command of Alaric. Considering the disaster he was forced to clean up, I think he dealt with it admirably. He basically completed the process of Christianity becoming the dominant favoured religion, which is probably the biggest reason that he's given the title the Great, but considering he was basically just capping off a process that had been started by Constantine, it's neither here nor there in my opinion. He won 2 civil wars against the West, and was the last emperor to rule a united East and West. Now we move to his son, the highly disinterested and incompetent Arcadius. He's going to be our first D-tier emperor, because I think even those ones who I've given a C to before, like Valens or Jovian, they at least either had some interest in reigning, in Valens' case, and some competence before the disaster at Adrianople, or in Jovian's case, he was handed a real crock of shit. But I think Arcadius, there's just not really much there. Lots of civil discontent between his handlers. He never really asserted himself. His son Theodosius II, one of the longest reigning emperors, I'd give a C. Again, quite disinterested, but at least there was a bit more peace under him. I think his handlers probably did a better job. You had the Theodosian walls. Not that they really deserve to be called that, because they were built when Theodosius was very young. He didn't actually start that project. So yeah, I'd put him a notch up from his father. Not as viciously incompetent. C tier for Theodosius II. Then we have Marcian, who I'm going to put as a B tier. Marcian had a short reign, but overall he achieved quite a few good things, even if perhaps some of that was down to luck. He managed to end the subsidies to the Huns, and also launched a small invasion, but of course they were mostly distracted in the West at the time, so whether you'd really call that particularly impressive or just lucky, I suppose is a bit of a debate. But all the same, I think he provided a good bit of actual directed imperial leadership, rather than having an emperor who was kind of disinterested and perhaps even just letting his handlers do the work. His successor, Leo I, I'd give him a B. Again, competent, very unfortunate that the expedition he sent to the West failed so disastrously. He wasn't commanding it, of course, but he did appoint Basiliscus to lead that, and it was a just huge disaster. If the empire had been more troubled, then, a loss of that proportion could really have been catastrophic. But in the end, the East was in a pretty stable position, and it managed to shrug it off, although of course, it was no longer able to offer too much help to the West. Leo's young son, Leo II, is the first emperor I'm going to be putting in this NA, non-applicable category. He only ruled for a few months as a child, so, he had no influence over policy, and had no opportunity to actually do anything. So I can't judge him, I'm just going to put him in non-applicable. Next we have Zeno, the emperor despised by the Romans because of his ethnic background as an Isaurian barbarian. Now, given the handicap that Zeno had because of his foreign background, he proved himself a very competent emperor and was able to deal with crises smartly. This not only included plots and usurpations against him, but also the constant threat of the Goths in the Balkans. He was briefly deposed by Basiliscus, but he fought his way back to the throne after just a year. He eventually managed to get rid of the Goths from the Balkans by sending them off to Italy under their leader Theodoric. He also patched up a shaky truce amongst the Eastern churches with a document known as the Henoticon. Now this angered Rome and triggered a schism, the Acacian Schism, but alienating Rome could be seen as a worthwhile trade-off for peace amongst the Eastern churches. And so, given the handicaps which he had, Zeno ruled competently and well, and deserves an A tier. Next we have the man who deposed Zeno, Basiliscus. I'm going to be putting him in the E tier. He had led the disastrous expedition to the West during Marcian's reign, and having proven himself a subpar general, he proved himself to be a terrible emperor. For despite Zeno's unpopularity, being a foreigner, Basiliscus quickly managed to alienate the populace and the army, allowing Zeno to return and depose him, and eventually have him killed. Ultimately, he was a bad general, and a terrible emperor. Zeno's true successor, Anastasius I, I'm giving an A. Most emperors, I think, in A tier, you'd associate them with some military conquest, or some great upheaval like Christianity and the founding of Constantinople. But Anastasius deserves the A tier for something far less flashy. Just for his reforms to the currency, to the administration. I don't think any emperor, very few emperors, I think, had such an interest and a dedication to just making sure that the machinery of government actually worked efficiently like a well-oiled machine. Of course, he left the treasury hugely well stocked, which Justinian was later able to take advantage of. Very frugal, very prudent. There were a few wars here and there. He was forced to deal with the Isaurians, who he eventually crushed and permanently broke as a force in the empire. Fought against the Persians with moderate success. He lost some fortresses, but did found Dara. Making good use of his fiscal prudence, he directed his monies towards the foundation of Dara, which would be a strong bulwark against the Persians. So he was always alert. Even when he perhaps failed, he was alert to try and make good that failure. Anastasius I was succeeded by Justin I, who was the first emperor of the Justinian dynasty. I'm putting Justin I in the B tier. By this point, the empire's situation was very manageable, despite wars with Persia. His reign was broadly a time of prosperity, and the imperial treasury continued to expand. Justin was firmly committed to Orthodox Chalcedonian Christianity, and so his reign saw the end of the Acacian schism with the popes. But the flip side of that was increased hostility towards, and the persecution of, Monophysite Christians in Egypt and Syria. But now let's move on to Justinian I. Don't worry, because I've not done this, but when I was pondering where I would put Justinian, part of me wanted to put him in B tier, and I know that seems kind of crazy, but you just have to hear me out. I've put him in A tier, but it's low on the A tier. I'm putting Justinian on the low end of the A tier. As a person, I think he was clearly very brilliant. I can't shake the feeling that just because of how costly his conquests were, because of how overstretched they left the empire, I can never shake the feeling that the empire would have lasted longer had Justinian never reigned. I mean, you think the period before Justinian's death and after the fall of the Western Empire, that period where there weren't really that many threats, the empire had relatively easy to defend borders, was becoming hugely wealthy. Anastasius had built up like literal tons of gold. Wealthy, well defended, stable. And then by the end of Justinian's reign, he's done this impressive reconquest of the West. But at what cost? The empire is constantly fighting now. It enjoyed uncontested rule of Italy for just 14 years before the Lombards invaded the peninsula, eventually removing half of Italy from imperial control. It can barely hold on to the Balkans, it's fighting against Persia. On every front, it's just trying to put out one fire and then rushing to the next. There's no peace until Maurice almost seems to solve it, but then he gets deposed and the wars with the Persians fire off again. Justinian should have stopped with North Africa. I know that's, for someone of his ambition, that just wouldn't have seemed possible. But I'm really just quite torn on his legacy. Because, in many ways he did great things. Reforming the law code, building the Hagia Sophia. He was, a great man. But I'm just very torn. I like Justinian. But I feel I do have to emphasise that he's at the low end of the A tier. I think he did a lot of damage to Byzantium. Another thing we have to consider when evaluating Justinian is the Justinianic plague. Now, traditional literary accounts, of course, emphasise the plague in apocalyptic terms, but in modern discourse on the subject there is a range of views, from those who downplay the plague entirely, to those that hold the maximalist views propagated by ancient literary sources. This is a subject I'm definitely going to have to read more about in future, but I think at the moment I'm coming down on the moderately minimalist side of the argument, going off some of the points raised by Anthony Caldelis in his book The New Roman Empire, that Justinian, for starters, was able to keep operating the empire at a high level, waging war on several fronts, and still putting big armies into the field, which surely wouldn't have been possible if there was a huge loss of population and corresponding loss of taxes and manpower. Apparently, the evidence from papyri in Egypt and from laws issued by Justinian at the time offers a mixed picture as to the potential economic effects of the plague. Certainly, it doesn't seem to go strongly one way or the other. And I'm mentioning all this because the plague is often used as a way to kind of exculpate Justinian perhaps of some of the responsibility for the damage done to the empire. Because of course, if the empire had lost 50% of its population, of course it would have been wrecked, and Justinian wouldn't really be to blame for that. But if the plague of Justinian wasn't quite so bad, then you do have to take a harsher look about Justinian's own activities and reassess how central they were to wrecking the empire and leaving it overextended and impoverished. Certainly it's something to consider, and if you do take the lower end of the scale on the plague argument, then I do think it will make you a bigger critic of Justinian. Now we have Justinian's successor, Justin II, who I'm putting in C tier. Now that might be, I feel a bit unfair doing that, considering that Justin II literally did go a bit insane. There aren't really many successors you can attribute to his reign, even when he was all there. I mean, to his credit, he did at least manage to appoint a successor / co-ruler in the form of Tiberius II, but even then I've, got my qualms with Tiberius. In 568 the Lombards invaded. Justin wasn't able to do too much to stop it, which again I wouldn't say is his fault. I think Justinian had left the empire extraordinarily overextended. Anyway, I'm putting him C tier. Then we have Tiberius II, who again is more competent, but I'm always frustrated. I'm not sure whether to put him in C or B. I just think he was too wasteful with money, at a time when the empire probably couldn't waste money. I mean, he was broadly successful in his wars, but I think I have to put him as C tier. Then we have Maurice, perhaps the most underrated emperor in all of Byzantine history. I'm going to put him in A tier. It almost seemed as if he had the problems cracked. He was able to sort out Persia, took back a huge swath of territory, seized on an opportunity in the form of Khosrow II and put him on the throne. That was a risk. It paid off. He got back lots of territory in Mesopotamia and Armenia, stopped having to pay tribute to the Persians, so that was one front ticked off. Eventually, at great length, they defeated the Avars and drove them back, so that was another front just about ticked off. Again, it would eventually lead to the armies mutinying, but at the same time it was still a good success in and of itself. And then in Italy, his reforms of grouping them all into an exarchate was, well needed and displayed a lot of foresight. It's just unfortunate that he was so, I guess, deaf to the conditions of his soldiers, because in the end, that's what cost him his throne. He sent his men across the Danube to winter there, fully well knowing that they probably would try and revolt, because he had sent men across the Danube to winter there before, back in 593, and they had revolted and demanded to go back across the Danube, and they'd relented, and the officers had relented, and they'd encamped south of the Danube. So it's not like this was unforeseen. And it was just very unfortunate that Maurice capped off his reign in that way. But overall, I think there was a lot of success. I'm going to put him in A tier. I mean, even though that success would pretty much come to naught within a decade or so, I still think he deserves it, because I think he got very close to possibly doing something incredible in getting the empire out of its rut. I think he was very close to doing that, but I think in the end, kind of like Sisyphus, I suppose, the boulder rolled straight back down to the bottom of the valley. And this is where we pick up with the next emperor, Phocas, who I think is justifiably hated, but the hatred of him, the villainization of him is unjustifiably strong. He wasn't Satan, he was just vaguely incompetent. I'm going to put Phocas in D tier, I think. And now we come to Heraclius, one of the most tragic yet heroic of all the Eastern Roman emperors. It took him over the course of 18 years. He fought off the Persian invasion and won back all the provinces that they had lost. I mean, that was just a titanic undertaking, and testament to not only his grit and his determination and his skills as a general, but the fact that he was able to keep his throne during those dark years of the Persian invasions is really testament to his ability to inspire confidence. It's a shame, though, once he had recovered the provinces in the east, that he lost them so shortly after to the Arab invasions. Given the pretty terrible state of the defences, I mean, Heraclius had only just reoccupied the Levant, Syria, Palestine. The defences weren't really in order. The empire was exhausted, as was the Sassanid Empire. Yeah, it marked a really tragic end to an otherwise glorious reign. If he had died in 628, he would have been regarded as one of the all-time heroes. You know, like Caesar or Scipio. Now, to follow on from Heraclius, we have two emperors who I'm going to put in the non-applicable category. Those are Heraclius Constantine and Heraclius. Both of them ruled for a very short period of time. Heraclius was still a minor, so he wasn't ruling in his own right. I can't really judge them on, what they achieved, because they had no time to achieve anything, good or bad. So I'm just going to put both of them in NA. Next on the list we have Constans II, the son of Heraclius Constantine, and so the grandson of Heraclius. Yeah, I think he was C tier. Not a lot of what he did was successful or perhaps wise. I mean, the imperial navy was crushed under his leadership at the Battle of the Masts, moving to Italy, trying to relocate the capital to Syracuse in Sicily. Probably an unwise decision. But at the same time, he was active, and so I think you do have to give him that at least. He wasn't shirking his duties, even if he perhaps wasn't the most successful emperor in fighting off the Arab incursions. That's not true of his son, however, Constantine IV, who I'm going to put in B tier. He was much more successful than his father, and defeated the Arab raids or the siege against Constantinople. He protected the capital against that. His forces were defeated by the Bulgars, and so this marked the entrance of the Bulgars, later the Bulgarians, onto the European stage as a major opponent of the empire. But overall, I think B tier. Successful reign. Next we have Justinian II, who I'm going to put in C tier. He was competent, and he did achieve good things, but he was just so unpredictable and unstable, deposed twice. The good that he brought to the empire was, very quickly undone by his anger and his inability to find diplomatic or, politically adroit solutions to problems. He kept shooting himself and the empire in the foot. And, yeah, I can't give him any more than a C, unfortunately. Although he is a very kind of dramatic, charismatic figure, I really can't give him any more than that. Now we're going on to the 20 Years' Anarchy, so I'll try and go through these very quickly. Leontius, I'm putting in D tier. Tiberius III, I'm putting in B tier. Philippicus Bardanes, I'm putting in D tier. Then we have Anastasius II, who I'm putting in B tier. Theodosius III, who I'm going to put in C tier. And now we're onto the Isaurian dynasty. Now we're moving on to some heavy hitters, starting with Leo III, the Isaurian, who I'm putting in A tier. Straight off the bat, Leo was forced to contend with the Arab siege of Constantinople, and, in defeating that, he very literally saved the empire, so you've got to give him lots of credit for that. Again, defeated the Arabs many more times, and iconoclasm, it probably wasn't a big impact on, especially during Leo's time. It wasn't such a big deal, I think, especially for people quite far away from the imperial authorities, and it's unfortunate that later iconophile writers so unfairly maligned the iconoclast emperors. They definitely don't deserve it. Leo III, A tier. His son, Constantine V, A tier. Again, ruled the empire very capably, formed the Tagmata. Very competent, capable general. Just bread and butter stuff. He was good at what an emperor had to be good at. A tier. Leo IV, the Khazar, I'm going to put in B. He had a very short reign, but I think while he was there, he was competent. Constantine VI. Just dreadful. D tier. Maybe even E tier. Ultimately, Constantine did not have a single redeeming quality as far as being a ruler is concerned. He was militarily defeated, at home he was unpopular, made foolish decisions, such as illegally marrying his mistress. He made himself unpopular with both the army and the people, and managed to maneuver himself into the unprecedented position of being deposed by his own mother. Irene of Athens, the mother of Constantine VI, who blinded him, deposed him. Perhaps C tier or D tier. I'm stuck between C or D for Irene. Perhaps I'll put her in C tier. I'm giving Irene this rating because ultimately blinding and possibly killing her son was very short-termist and backed her into a political dynastic corner, ultimately from which she would be deposed, just 5 years after she had taken the throne. But, in other aspects she did seem to be competent, certainly much more so than her son, which is not saying much. She was also responsible for ending the first period of iconoclasm. Now we have Nicephorus I. I'm putting him in B tier, because while his reign did end pretty disastrously, by being slaughtered by the Bulgarians and all, he did at least put in place a lot of, reforms to the administration of the empire that set it on a firmer footing. His son, Staurakios, again I'm going to say non-applicable, NA. He only ruled for a few months and had his spine cut during the slaughter, Pliska, which is where his father died, so he was basically not ruling at all, so I can't judge him. Michael I Rangaby, D tier, just no leadership, no competence, real non-entity. Leo V, the Armenian, good general, provided finally some actual competent resistance to the Khan Krum. He was also responsible for the reintroduction of iconoclasm. B tier for Leo V. Then for his murderer and successor, Michael II, I'm going to go C. He had a tough reign. Definitely, he had the cards stacked against him, dealing with a big revolt, which kept the empire busy, but I think C. He was a kind of steady hand at the tiller, but the empire just kind of, lost stuff on all fronts, really. Theophilus, he's kind of one of those very charismatic figures. He's like a less bad version of Michael IX, who reigned much later, in that he was very active and going about the place, but, wasn't always fully successful. Very boisterous. I don't know, I'll put him B tier. Michael III, the drunkard, as he's unfairly maligned. Again, I'll put him B tier. He's been unfairly propagandized against, I think, by the historians of the Macedonian dynasty. Although he wasn't, the most active emperor in terms of actually governing day to day, he was a active general. He just put his trust in the wrong person, in Basil II. Or the right person, I suppose, because Basil didn't make a hash of ruling. Speaking of Basil, he's the next emperor up on this list. I'm going to give him an A tier, I think. He was a successful general, helped prop up the Byzantine position in southern Italy. He was a competent administrator and kind of put in place, or kind of started the reform and recodification of the law codes that would be completed under his son Leo VI. And also I think he was a very astute politician in that he was able to rise from nothing, claim the imperial title, and face remarkably few challenges throughout his own reign, despite the particularly sordid circumstances in which he claimed the throne. So I think really Basil deserves his A. Moving on to his son, Leo VI, I'm going to give him a B tier, because while he was conscientious, the empire did suffer abroad, quite a lot of military defeats. Leo of Tripoli raided and kind of mostly destroyed Thessalonica. The Bulgarians delivered a pretty stinging defeat to the Byzantines, and the Bulgarian War was probably more Leo's fault as well. But again, Leo was conscientious, and aside from the case of the Bulgarian War, where he probably had a role in stoking it, the military failures, have to be chalked down to some extent to his generals. His scandals with 4 wives was pretty embarrassing for him, but ultimately I think he has to be commended for pushing through until he had an heir in the form of Constantine VII. Because ultimately, if that hadn't happened, then the Macedonian dynasty would have died then and there, and the empire would have been robbed of future rulers like Basil II. So I think Leo VI deserves B. Next is Alexander, who reigned for just 1 year. He was apparently a thoughtless fool and a drunk, and triggered a very damaging war with Bulgaria. I'll be putting him in the D tier. Now we're going to move to Constantine VII, a man who technically reigned for over 4 decades, but most of his reign was spent in the shadow of Romanus Lekapinos, and we'll be getting on to Romanus I in a second. I think Constantine perhaps deserves a B tier, maybe C. Again, I think he was an able picker of men. Very, very lucky on the political front, considering Romanus probably could have done away with him if he really wanted to. But Constantine's years of personal rule from 944 to 959, I think he did them well. Not remarkably, he was just competent and capable, and the empire continued its resurgence. Now we have to kind of go backwards a little bit to talk about Romanus I, whose reign was kind of slap bang in the middle and concurrent with Constantine VII's reign. I would also give Romanus I a B. He did successfully deal with a lot of the crises that he inherited, such as the Bulgarian War against Simeon, but again, he didn't really conclude it on particularly impressive terms. It was only that Simeon kind of got tired of battering the Byzantines. So that wasn't particularly brilliant, but he did deal with it competently, and under his aegis, John Kirkuras would lead successful expeditions east. He managed to deal with the Russian raid on Constantinople, and for the time he was ruling, I think he did a good job of it. Not impressive, but respectable, so it's why I've got to give him a B. Now we're going to jump to Romanus II, the son of Constantine VII, grandson of Romanus I. I don't know what to say, it's kind of hard to judge. Maybe a C tier, although his reign was a time of, prosperity and military victory. It doesn't seem that he himself was particularly involved in ruling. He had very competent generals around him, he had Nicephorus Phocas, men like Joseph Bringas, so I don't really think too much of his reign's success can be chalked up to him. He seems to have been slightly disinterested, so I'm putting him in C. Next we have Nicephorus Phocas, Nicephorus II. I'm going to put him in B, because for all his success as a general, he was an atrocious politician, and, systematically lost the support of the various constituencies in Byzantine society, the church, the people. That's a very strong mark against him as an emperor, because he only made it 6 years, and he could have achieved much more success had he reigned longer, but again, his deficiencies as a politician cost him his life. Next, we have the first S-tier emperor, John I, John Tzimiskes. Perhaps that's surprising. I'm sure some of you were expecting Basil II to be the first S-tier, but I think John deserves it. He had a very short reign, but the time he was in power, he achieved so much and displayed so many kind of positive traits that if he had only reigned for 10, 15 years, I'm sure there would be a vast catalogue of victories and triumphs that could be chalked up to his name. I mean, he defeated the Rus, conquered the eastern parts of Bulgaria in the process, which itself was the biggest conquest the empire had made in centuries, led successful campaigns into the east, and unlike Nicephorus, he was a good emperor, he was a good politician, he was popular, and that counts for a lot. I think had he reigned for longer, of course Basil would then be an adult when he took the throne, so that probably would have saved him a bit of trouble. And I think John would have been able to carry out lots more successful military campaigns, diplomatic expeditions. He also dealt quite well with the Holy Roman threat, signing a marriage between Otto II and Theophano, his niece. So, overall, I think John really does deserve the S-tier rank. And now we have our second S-tier emperor, Basil II. I'm fresh off a 90-minute documentary I made on Basil II, so I could probably say a lot about him, but I'll try and keep it brief. I think my part on Justinian went on way too long. I mean, what is there to say about Basil that hasn't been said already? The sole grave mistake he made was not having any children. It was foolish, irresponsible, but aside from that, his reign was marked by success and prudence and left the empire stronger than it had been in 300, 400 years, and well positioned to take advantage of any threats or opportunities that might arise. And it's a shame that Basil didn't have more competent successors to build on, or at least defend, the achievement of his reign. But the Bulgarians were conquered, which Basil only achieved through countless tireless campaigns. I think few rulers in history have worked so tirelessly to achieve a goal, in Basil's case the conquest of Bulgaria, but unfortunately Basil's successors made a bit of a hash of it. And so now we begin with the more troubled reigns of the 11th century emperors. Starting with Constantine VIII, the brother of Basil II, I think he deserves C tier. His reign was very short, not too much happened in it, but in that time he didn't really demonstrate any aptitude for ruling. Next we have Romanus III, who again displayed no aptitude for ruling. I think D tier. Then we have Michael IV, who I think was a really slept-on emperor. He's got quite a tragic, almost romantic tale. This kind of boy with epilepsy is brought into the royal court and catches the eye of the Empress Zoe. She raises him up to the imperial office, and despite having no experience, despite his visibility, he ends up being quite energetic and competent. He relied a lot, of course, on his family, on his brother, John Orphanotrophus, but he deserves a B, I think, B tier for Michael IV, just because of his competency displayed in the face of his own utter inexperience, his youth, his disability. So yeah, I think that's well deserved. Next we have Michael V. I think he's probably an E tier, just completely incompetent and foolish. Got himself deposed after like a month or however long it was. No political nous, just a fool. Next we've got Constantine IX, who I think probably deserves a C. Not quite as terrible as some people have made out. Not quite as good as Anthony Caldelis seems to think he is. Yeah, C. Then comes Theodora, the daughter of Constantine VIII, who by this point is in her 70s or 80s, and she rules for about a year and a half. Again, such a short period, not too many crises to judge her by, but she seems to have ruled competently. Maybe C or B. It's hard to say. Perhaps C, because she didn't manage to find a very good successor. The successor in question was Michael VI. I'm putting Zoe in the non-applicable category because she reigned for such a brief period of time. I think Michael VI deserves a D tier. I think he only ruled for a year. He managed to alienate the generals and, just completely threw it away. D tier. Really no aptitude for ruling. Isaac I, the first ruler of the Komnenos dynasty, although of course his rule wasn't continuous with the other Komnenians. I'll give Isaac a B. He ruled for a short period of time, but he did at least have his head in the game, and he was trying to effect reforms of the army, and trying to get it back on its feet in the face of increased challenges from the Pechenegs. Of course the Turks would be in the neighbourhood pretty soon. I think if he had ruled longer he would have done a lot of good, would have done much better than his immediate successor, Constantine X. I'm going to have to give Constantine X E tier, just because he was completely ignorant of the threats facing the empire and did really nothing to better defend the empire, and in many ways made it worse by weakening some of the defences along the eastern border. The last towns of Italy were mostly mopped up during his reign. During his reign the Turks made continued incursions into the eastern frontier, and the empire was just not led capably to be able to stop them. Next we move on to Romanus IV. I think Romanus deserves a B tier. He was really messed up by the Ducas dynasty, by Andronicus Ducas, who betrayed him at the Battle of Manzikert. I think he was very unfortunate in the in-laws that he was lumped with, because they really messed him up big time. And then they cut his eyes out, of course. Next we have Michael VII, who I'm putting in E tier. I don't know of anyone in history less suited to rule. I don't know if you know English history, then maybe this comparison will make sense. But he reminds me of Henry VI, in that they just can't grasp ruling at all. It's like they have no bones in their body. They're invertebrate rulers. They have no spine, no ability to enforce their will on other people, and are seemingly perfectly content to be ruled by others, or to let others do the ruling for them. Michael VII was old enough by the time of his father's death. His father was Constantine X. He was old enough to rule for himself pretty much, but his mother still felt the need to marry Romanus IV to bring him on board. And then even when Michael's proper reign started, after Romanus IV was deposed in 1071, even after then he didn't display he displayed no ability to rule, and the empire was torn to pieces. Lost all of Anatolia during his reign, completely mismanaged the situation, and under his leadership the empire lost pretty much all of Anatolia. Fortunately he was deposed by Nicephorus III, who was just too old, and he just wasn't able to deal with all of the threats. He relied a lot on Alexios Komnenos, who then deposed him. I'll give Nicephorus III C tier. I don't think he was quite as bad as the others, but he was too old to be effective. Now we have Alexios I, who deserves an A. Not an S, because I think he lost quite a lot of battles that he personally led, but he did make up for it with his other talents of keeping men loyal to him, of politicking, of being able to suppress revolts and keep the throne, and gradually being able to manage and defeat the enemies one by one. I think Alexios was, saved the empire. Then we have John II, who recovered a great deal of Asia Minor. Alexios had made a lot of progress thanks to the Crusades and his own efforts to take back the northwest, cities like Nicaea, Smyrna and the kind of Aegean islands, and pushing deeper into the northwestern section. But John really took that to the next level, took back Pontus and the Black Sea coast, pushed south towards Caria, reasserted Byzantine authority over some of the Crusader states, took over parts of Cilicia. It's a shame he didn't rule longer, because unlike his successor Manuel, I think John was very much focused on the east, and in particular on Anatolia. And I think if his leadership had carried on, rather than him accidentally poisoning himself, then I think he would have probably gone a long way to reconquering Asia Minor. As it was, he was succeeded by Manuel I, who again I'm going to put in A tier, in spite of whatever failings he might have had, because I think he brilliantly managed quite a lot of the challenges facing the empire, really stamped himself on the empire. Not all of his projects were successful. He did conquer quite a lot of territory in the Balkans, although unfortunately that wouldn't last too long. It's a pity that Manuel wasted so much of his own energy and his money on trying to reconquer Italy, on trying to conquer Egypt. Yeah, he would have been much better served following in his father's footsteps and going more into Anatolia, perhaps on a less risky level, because although, of course, Manuel did try to take back Iconium, he was defeated at the Battle of Myriokephalon, and I think he may have been served by going for a less risky but less rewarding strategy, just small sieges here and there. But I think, broadly speaking, he was competent, charismatic, not popular. He's taxing his people too much for that, but very much in command, and I think he does deserve an A. Then we have his son, Alexios II, who I think has got to go into the non-applicable category. Then we have Andronicus I, the bloodthirsty tyrant. I'm going to put him D, because, he had some positives, like trying to cut down on corruption, but nothing that he did can outweigh the fact that the way he went about doing anything involved tyranny and murder and turning all of his subjects and supporters against him, until he was deposed after just 2 years in power. Then we have Isaac II, who I think probably deserves C. He wasn't the best emperor, he wasn't particularly inspired as a general or a leader, but he did try, and I don't think he ever shirked his duties. Then we have Alexios III, who I think is D. Again, he wasn't perhaps the worst thing in the world, but the empire just continued its downward spiral during his reign, and I don't think he was quite as active or competent as his brother in dealing with the threats that faced the empire. Next we have Alexios IV, the man who brought the Fourth Crusade to Constantinople. I'd probably put him in E tier. I mean, the Crusaders may have had designs on Constantinople even, before Alexios, or without his prodding, but he was kind of the key that allowed them to open that door that they then came barging through. So, E tier. I'm putting Alexios V in the non-applicable category because he reigned for such a short time in such difficult circumstances, but he should certainly be commended for his efforts in defending the city against the Crusader attacks. For this list, I'm only going to be looking at the emperors who ruled from Nicaea, so none of the rulers of Epirus or Trebizond. The first of these emperors in exile is Theodore I Lascaris, who I'm going to be giving a B tier. He founded Nicaea, established it as a base from which his successor John III would be able to retake most of the imperial territories in Europe, and Theodore managed to fend off quite ably many of the Latin threats. For Theodore I, it's a strong B. Now we come to his successor, John III, who I'm going to be giving an S tier. He's not as famous as the other S tiers like Basil I or John Tzimiskes, but when you consider by how much he expanded the empire, pushing all the way into Europe, conquering all the way across to Macedon, leaving the Latin Empire broken with the exception of its holding of Constantinople,
Relative to how he found it, you could say that John expanded the empire more than any emperor other than Justinian. If you think he probably added like 45% more territory onto the empire than when he found it. He fended off all the threats to the empire with consummate skill and left it as the most powerful state in the Balkans. Again, not as well known, but definitely deserving of S tier. Next we have Theodore II, who I'm going to be giving a B tier. He didn't reign for too long, but while he was on the throne he displayed a lot of competence and interest in ruling the state, especially in cutting down the power of aristocratic families, although that probably left him with something of a bad rap. Next is John IV, who only ever ruled as a child, so he's going in the non-applicable category. Next we have the first Paleologan emperor, and the man who oversaw the recapture of Constantinople, Michael VIII. I'm going to be putting him in A tier, simply just because of his diplomatic skill. For the entirety of his reign he did a very good job fending off an incredibly threatening and undiplomatic Latin Europe. His reign of course saw the recapture of Constantinople, the victory at Pelagonia, he re-established Byzantine rule over parts of the Peloponnese, but really his biggest successes came on the diplomatic front, although I think in this pursuit he perhaps went too far in trying to form a unified church. I think he accepted Catholicism for too long, when it was clearly making him far too unpopular and not really holding back the popes that much. But on the whole I would say he was very successful in fending off threats like Charles of Anjou. Next is Andronicus II, one of the longest reigning Roman emperors of all time. Unfortunately one of the worst, certainly had one of the most disastrous reigns. I think I'm going to put him in E tier really. He just oversaw a very gradual but ultimately fatal decline in Eastern Roman power. He let the navy rot away to nothing, which allowed the Latin maritime republics to basically dominate the sea lanes and extort privileges from Byzantium. The empire lost most of its holdings in Anatolia, and by the time Andronicus died, the empire had just a few outposts on the northwestern coast, as well as the city of Philadelphia, I think it was, which rather impressively managed to hold on despite being landlocked and perhaps 100 miles from the coast. It held on far longer than most other cities in Anatolia. Of course, Andronicus's efforts to fend off the Turks led him to make the disastrous decision to allow the Catalan Company to try and do the fighting for him, which eventually led to conflict between the Empire and the Catalans, creating a furious and devastating conflict in Thrace. Really, there's little good you can say about Andronicus II's reign. As for the reign of his grandson and ultimate successor, Andronicus III, his reign was a big improvement. I'm going to be putting him in B tier. Ultimately, his was the last reign, I think, where the empire had any chance whatsoever of recovering its position, and did also take over Epirus as well, for a brief period. He was active, and I think, had he reigned longer, perhaps he could have stemmed what seemed to be, and what proved to be, a ultimately terminal and constant decline. His reign was a bright spot, I'd say, but unfortunately, upon his death in 1341, the empire embarked into a catastrophic civil war, the most devastating in its history. This civil war took place under John V, who began his reign as a child, and in fact had 3 separate reigns, punctuated by various usurpations and rebellions, and he would only finally die in 1391. John V I'm going to be putting in C tier. He wasn't a particularly effective emperor. The biggest catastrophe of John's reign wasn't really his fault, because he was only a child when it was going on, but this was the civil war between John Cantacazinus and John V's mother. Eventually, it destroyed the empire. As for the rest of John's reign when he was an adult, although he wasn't particularly successful in fending off the empire's threats, he was at least active in trying to petition Western Europe for aid. But I can't really say too many good things about him, so I'm going to put him in C tier. Now we have a lot of emperors whose reigns were surrounded by John V's. First we have John VI, otherwise John Cantacazinus, who usurped the throne and ruled alongside John V for a while. Now, irrespective of what personal qualities John VI may have had, good or bad, I'm putting him in D tier because the civil war, he invited ruin upon the empire by asking for foreign help, which ultimately allowed foreign powers to carve up the empire. By the time John VI had seized the throne in 1347, the empire had been reduced to a very small area of land in Thrace, with other scattered holdings around the Aegean. but a lot of the damage of the civil war, I would have to say, lies on John VI's shoulders. Next we have Andronicus IV, who briefly deposed John V and ruled from 1376 to 1379. I'm going to put him in D tier because, well, for the brief time he was in the throne, he didn't really do much good. And also, before he had usurped John V, who was his father, he had also been very difficult about helping him out when he was travelling through Western Europe. Andronicus basically got his father trapped in Venice by refusing to pay debts, and was very unhelpful. So I'm going to put him in D tier. I apologise if this is a bit confusing, but this period was unfortunately overflowing with Johns. Next we have John VII, who ruled just for 1 year in 1390. He was the grandson of John V, and I'm going to put John VII in C tier. Now, of course, as emperor he ruled for such a short period of time, there's not much I can judge him on, but after this rebellion and his short reign, he did prove to be a fairly capable subordinate of the other emperors, but there's not really too much I can say. He's almost erring towards the non-applicable category. John V finally died in 1391, and his true successor was Manuel II. I'm going to be putting him in B tier. These last emperors really had little chance of actually saving the empire, but Manuel was active. He travelled to Western Europe, visited France and England, trying to petition the West, really the only viable source of aid for an army of some sort. And while he didn't come away with too much from these efforts, he should at least get points for trying. So Manuel II I'm going to be giving a B. John VIII, the penultimate Roman emperor. There was little he could do by this point. The empire had been reduced to just Constantinople, parts of the Peloponnese, a few islands in the Aegean. Again, John VIII tried to petition the West for aid. He travelled to Italy and ratified a union of the Greek and Roman churches. But again, little good came of this. Although I believe it was during his reign that the Crusade of Varna did try to stem the Ottoman advance, although it was crushed. In the end he was a competent ruler, and perhaps in better times he would have been remembered for some great deeds. But as it was, the empire was on its last legs. And now we come to the final emperor, Constantine XI, who, like his two predecessors, I'm going to be giving a B tier. He was in a hopeless position, but he did his best. From the start he was in a fairly hopeless position, but he did his best and fought heroically to the end. Also, if you consider his time as ruler of parts of the Peloponnese, then he proved himself an able general. But at the end of the day, against the overwhelming power of the Ottomans, there was little he could do.